So I'll give y'all a little bit of background. This is my home county in North Carolina. We're about an hour above Charlotte, hour and a half below the mountains. We're right here at the base of the foothills. We pretty much farm this upper part of Lincoln County, Catawba County, and we used to farm all the way over here to I-77. We've actually cut back on our acres here in Iredell just because of how far we have to travel. We're pretty spread out in this part of the state. But talking about fertility and nutrient management. As you can tell, there's not a beard. I was a lot younger. This is actually when I was still a career fireman, but this is a picture of our very first cover crop. We learned a lot of important lessons with this cover crop. Saw a video. I got told about cover crops by our NRCS. I think we planted 11 species. We didn't cut back on any of the seeding rates. I think we only had to spray it like 3 times to get it, dead and brown finally. So we've learned a lot of lessons on the farm, but when we started looking at this right here, this was essentially just a defensive trait. We had winter erosion, we had winter weeds, and that was to manage these two issues. We really didn't have an understanding of biology, nutrient cycling, fertility. The people that came to the row crop side today, we talked a lot about carbon to nitrogen ratio. This right here, you're probably 20-1, probably in that area. This broke down probably within the first 6 weeks, so a lot of the nutrients that are tied up in this were released to that year's crop. A couple years later, this is typically what we look like. You can see we've got rye, we've got triticale, we've got oats. You can see a little bit of the vetch in this picture. There's crimson clover in there. So if you're doing row crop, once again, everybody talks about that allelopathic effect. If the corn germinates, it's not that. You're really looking at nitrogen tie-up and nutrient tie-up. So one of the things we do on our farm, and we talked a little bit about it already today, is running a tissue analysis or a cover crop sample analysis to see what's in here. There's 100 different ways you can do it. We do 2 foot by 1 foot, so we get 2 square foot samples. We'll pull 3 of these randomly across a field to try to get a representation of what's out there. We'll send it into the laboratory. What we used to do is we couldn't send it to the laboratory on a wet basis when we were using the one from the state, so I had to dry it here on the trailer. And then once we got it down to moisture, we would bag it up. NRCS has a recommendation where you can actually take this residue and you can actually cook it down in an oven. My DC did that for me one year and he almost got divorced for the smell, so I don't really recommend that one. But carbon and nitrogen ratios, y'all have heard me talk about these out there in the cornfield for a lot. Our goal is 40-1. And so what we have found out, and this is about 6-7 years of on-farm research on our farm and working with other farmers, our annual rainfall is about 40 inches. If we get a 40-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, we're taking 80% of that nitrogen, 75% of the P, 75% of the K, and all the micronutrients below it on our report. If we get up to a 60-1, those numbers are going to get cut by a third. If we get to 80-1, we're not taking any benefit for the nitrogen and probably less than 5% of the rest of the nutrients that are on this report. And if you've never seen one, this is what a cover crop analysis report looks like. We get dry matter in tons per acre. This cover crop right here was really heavy in legumes and pretty low on small grain. But we were at 2.65 tons to the acre. Once again, that carbon to nitrogen ratio, so at a 16.7, I'm going to take at least a 90% credit for this 166 pounds of nitrogen in that cover crop. So this over here is on a dry matter basis. This is on our tons of dry matter to the acre. So look at how much carbon we have. Nitrogen, we're going to take a 90% credit for that, an 85% credit for the phosphorus, 85% for the potassium, and all the way down through these, we're going to take 85% of that. That's what's actually going to be available to this year's cash crop. And this is a way to do it without guessing. We've been told for so long, take a credit for this or credit for that. This is the way we can do it and actually know what's going to be out there. And by the way, if you have questions along the way, raise your hand. We can talk about whatever it is while we're going over it if you want to. So this is where we started out. You can see how good the soils are in North Carolina. It makes Minnesota look terrible. Whoa, somebody's still awake.
Question.
She had coffee.
You got your availability, you say 85%.
Right.
Based on how much time, like say in Minnesota, they have a shorter time for it to break down. Do we have to lower that to 75%?
No, this is based on a 6-month period.
6 months.
So essentially this is based off of like February to essentially pushing into August. So that's essentially what I would say for y'all. You're going to see, who grows small grain up here? When does your wheat green up? Okay, when does your rye green up?
December, February last year.
So
Typically it's April.
typically it's April.
Right.
All right, so base it off of that. So like we see wheat green up in my area around February 15th. Well, the reason we're seeing wheat green up is because what's happening in the soil. Higher temperatures, microbial activity, correct? We're coming out of dormancy. So base it off of that. So if you're up here in Minnesota, where...
90-day corn we're putting in cover crops.
Yep.
For the corn, right.
Oh yeah, you'll still get a benefit out of that. And that's what I'm trying to get at. So say we're at April the 15th. When are you going to plant your corn after the cover crop? And terminate this cover? Like when are you going to plant the corn in this?
Typically have to terminate early before we plant.
Okay.
So then you got your maturity date. I'm just afraid a lot of the residue isn't gonna be broke down soon enough to be beneficial in the same season.
So what's your rainfall up here?
27.
All right, so we'll just use these numbers then. So if you're at 27, then you're below on that C to N ratio. Okay, so if we're gonna see April, when's your 90-day corn gonna finish out? End of August, 1st September? It's middle of September. End of September. Okay. Sorry, I'm doing math in my head. So we've got. So you're at 5 months. So if we're taking 85%, divide that by 6 and multiply by 5. Anybody got a calculator where y'all can help me out with that real quick? Take 85, divide by, okay, so 70%. That's scientifically based on the number of days that instead of taking a bigger credit here, you're at 70% on P and K. On nitrogen, you would take 90, divide it by 6, and multiply by 5. All right, so we're 75 on nitrogen, we're 70% below that. And that's if we see a C to N ratio of 27 to 1 or less, which is what y'all were saying. Your rainfall up here is typically 27 inches. And so this is a way that you can scientifically look at what's going to be available while that crop is growing. And we're even taking into consideration that we know essentially when we're switching into those reproductive stages and we're going R1 typically into R2, we're starting to see that plant switch off from pulling nutrients through the roots into the plant, and now we're going into that plant cannibalization that early in the season. So if you're going to run one of these cover crop analysis, then I would say 75% nitrogen, 70% everything below it. Any other questions on that before we move on? So we got asked earlier, how quick can you see a benefit? So this is year one. The first year that I started farming, we took this picture. It's pretty much junk. I mean, that's what we farm. We farm some pretty junk ground. It's devoid of carbon. There's not a lot of roots. We didn't have earthworms, organic matter. This is actually some of our heavier ground at that point in time that had more clay content. I would say organic matter was ranging 1.1, 1.2% on the good parts of the field. The sandier parts of the field were probably 0.7, 0.8. This right here is what we look like in 4 years. Now this is a 16-inch spade sample. And you can see, we still have that orange, red color, high iron content clay here in the bottom, 8 to 16. But look at the 0 to 8. We're starting to see the ground start to change colors. We're getting a little bit darker. Caught this little earthworm right here. Some of the things we look at on the Haney test, so this is from the fall of 13 to the spring of 22. Our CO2 respiration went up 720%. We've talked a lot about WEOC on the row crop guys when we were in the field. WEOC is water extractable organic carbon. It increased 590%. Look at our organic matter change, 5.6% across the whole farm. You know, I was told when I first started farming by our university, if I increased organic matter by 1% in my lifetime, I was doing pretty good. I think they're shitty farmers. That's the only way how to say it. Now look where we're at. This is 2023. So this is the same field that went from this with, you know, we've got a little sand, we've got a little clay, some mica, some silts. We're starting to see color changes here. Now we look like dark chocolate cake. Now my soils are not as black as yours that we've been out in the fields and the ones I've drove by on the way up here, but that is drastically different in the amount of carbon and water holding capacity, biological function that we have in these soils. And so who's seen a Haney test? Who's ever, you don't count. How many of you have ever really truly dived deep into a Haney test? I mean, really dived into it. If you have questions, this is your time to ask. We're going to talk about nutrients. We're going to talk about what things mean. We're going to talk about ratios that we look at for our farm. If you have questions, this is your time to ask them. If you're running Bray already up here in Minnesota, this has a lot that Bray already has. It was just used in a different extraction. We're looking at nitrogen. So the Haney test has nitrate nitrogen, ammonium, and then we've got our inorganic total. And then right here, we've got organic nitrogen and its total. And then right here, what a lot of people don't pay attention to is nitrogen release and nitrogen reserve. So if you have low soil respiration and low percent MAC, you'll see nitrogen reserve start to go up. And that just means you don't have the biological activity to actually break that organic nitrogen into forms that the plant can then take up. That's one of the indicators that we look at when people send me, you know, soil tests. The first place I go is right here. What's our soil respiration, our percent MAC, and then looking up here, what's our nitrogen release? Are we seeing a big reserve here? And the same thing over here at phosphorus. We have an organic phosphorus release and a reserve. So we have a biological indicator here. So Liz did a webinar. Well, she left. Man, she's always letting me down on leaving. Liz, where'd you go? Who knows? So she did a webinar a while back. If she comes back, we'll ask her. But the original, so this is on Rocky Ford Road. This soil respiration, when I first started farming, was 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I thought that was pretty good. Now we've got this field in the 4 and the 500s. When we look at percent MAC, we were in 70s, 80s. Maybe I think we had one field that maybe was at a 90%. Now we're in the 229%. So the way that you look at the Haney test, organic carbon is the checking account that we're paying the microbes, and the microbes are showing us how they're processing with percent MAC. It's microbial active carbon. So this 229% means that I'm using all of this, and if you use all of your savings, or if you use all of your checking account, you have to come up here to savings where soil organic matter is. Soil organic matter is about 51, 52%. Hey, you're back. Do you remember what our starting soil respirations were when you were looking back all the way to 13? I mean, they were what, like 50, 60, 70s?
Yeah, maybe 50.
Yeah. But what you've got to do here is you can, if you have percent MAC over 100, it's not necessarily a terrible thing. But it also means that you're going to burn up some organic matter. And so if we're seeing like really large dips in soil organic matter, then we know that we need to be putting more carbon in there. And we can do it with cover crops, manure, compost. There's tons of different ways for us to get that organic carbon up. But this is the same field where we started at 1.1 to 1.2%. And this is, I wish we would have went deeper at that point in time. But can anybody see what that number is right there for organic matter? It's 7.5. So this farm now, depending on the field, is ranging from about 7.5 to 8.2% organic matter. I don't think we're at the threshold yet. I think we can probably push that up into the 10, 12% range. And for where I'm at in the south, where we don't get microbial activity dropping off in the wintertime, I think that's pretty dang good. looking at carbon to nitrogen ratio, once again, right here it is on the Haney test, we're at 11.7. We talked about earlier for row crops, typically for corn, 12 to 14. If we're going into beans, we can go up to that 14, 16 without seeing a yield hit. If I start looking at pastures, most pastures we look at that are good perennial rotationally grazed pastures, most of the time I see 18, 20%. The problem that you're going to see in row crops, specifically corn, if you see 20% carbon to nitrogen ratio right here, you're going to have nitrogen tie-up. In corn, if you see that C to N ratio go up. Then we start looking at normal nutrients, the big ones. Phosphorus, available pounds of phosphorus in that field. Potassium, and we've got all our nutrients right here in parts per million. One of the things that I pay attention to is calcium to magnesium ratios. If you see a calcium magnesium ratio closer than 3 to 1, you are going to have excessive water ponding on those soils. Those soils are going to get tight, it's going to rain, and your infiltration rate is going to be nothing. That magnesium to calcium ratio does matter. Then we start looking at potassium to sodium. If your potassium and sodium are closer than 10 to 1, so that's 10 potassium and 1 sodium, that means that we're going to see sodium displace potassium uptake in the plant. So if you're having issues with potassium deficiencies in your plants, this could be one of the causes. You could have really good potassium and your sodium could be elevating and displacing that potassium. And we essentially just look at manganese, iron, aluminum, sulfur, zinc for what they are. We really don't look at a lot of ratios there. One of the things that the Haney test does not do is boron. So we use Mehlich 3, and I would imagine if you're running Bray, Myron, where are you at? Do you know on Bray, are they using DPTA for y'all's micros? Okay, so that's going to be fairly close to what we're seeing with our Mehlich extract. And when we were starting to look at boron, that was one of the first really nutrients we started looking at on the micro side. We would pull a Mehlich 3 test and it would say we needed to apply 0.25 pounds of boron. Well, we would apply it. We would put granubor out, or we would foliar spray like a 10% liquid, solubor in a wide drop. And then when we were tissue sampling, we kept continually seeing that boron was either on the lower end of adequate or it was deficient for like 2 years. And then Lance was telling me, he was like, you're not putting enough out there. And I said, well, how do we know what to put out there? And he said, the problem is the Mehlich extract is pulling out too much nutrients out of that soil that aren't actually being available. So there's a new test, well, I'm not going to say a new testing method, it's new to me. It's called a hot water extraction. So on boron and molybdenum, we started doing hot water extractions on those two nutrients. It cost about $4. Well, the hot water extraction was calling for just over double the amount of boron that we were putting on with Mehlich, and it's the first time that we ever started seeing adequate or above adequate numbers on boron and molybdenum. So if you're pulling tissue tests and you're applying the amount of boron that a conventional test is telling you to put out there, maybe it's good to look at doing those hot water extractions. They're cheap. Another quarter pound of boron, that's probably costing you a couple bucks an acre, but if you're deficient in it, and like David said earlier when we were in the field, it's the law of the minimum. If you have NP and K right and you have sulfur right and boron's on the extremely low end, what's your limiting factor in that crop yield? It's going to be the boron. And so this is a 0 to 6. We look at, nitrogen. The Haney test picked up 69.2 pounds of nitrogen. It's like I told y'all in the field, we're spending about $2 an acre on this. So what's nitrogen cost up here in Minnesota? I mean, I know anhydrous is cheap, but like urea, what's y'all's urea price up here? 60 cents a pound. So if we do 60 cents a pound times 69, it's over 30 bucks an acre in savings in nitrogen for a $2 test. That's not too bad. This is our 6 to 12. Who in here pulls their own soil samples? How deep do you go?
6 inches.
6 inches? 6, 7 inches. Anybody else do anything different than that? How many of you in here farm in a flower pot? Does anybody farm in a flower pot? So here's you do?
Yeah.
Oh, you growing daisies?
Yes, sir.
For the missus?
Yes, sir.
Smart man, see? He ain't even married yet and he already knows. So, North Carolina University told me in no-till, we just needed to test from 0 to 4 inches deep. Nutrient stratification was going to happen. No-till wasn't going to see nutrients move below 4 inches deep. That's as deep as we needed to go. And every year it kept calling for more fertility and more fertility and more fertility. I'm like, this is insane. And I went to a conference and somebody made that same analogy. They said, do you farm a flower pot? And I said, no. He said, have you ever dug a root pit? And I said, yeah. And our corn roots were going down 3 or 4 feet deep. And he said, you need to start soil sampling deeper. Does anybody know what a Giddings probe is? Anybody ever used one? So a Giddings probe hooks up on the 3-point of a tractor and it'll pull a core down to 4 feet deep. And on 90% of our farms, we have soil samples down to 4 feet deep. We have seen carbon increase, organic matter increase, nutrient levels increase. The amount of stuff that we're seeing in our crop ground go down to 4 feet deep. Now, obviously, once we get down below typically 18 inches, there's a few farms with really good aggregation that we see down to 24 inches. It really slows down in that amount of change and that fertility. But you need to be sampling 0 to 6 and 6 to 12 at a minimum on all your corn acres. Corn has such a good root system on it, and unless you have a water table issue in which the water table is coming up and pruning roots off, 12 inches is where you should be going down to at a minimum on your corn acres. Now on beans, I'm still sticking at 6. Now I'll test from 0 to 6 and 6 to 12 on most of our bean acres, but beans don't have as good of a root system, so we're typically making our fertility recommendations off of that 0 to 6. But look at the nutrients. We're still at 6.4% organic matter in a 6 to 12 sample. We're still over almost 40 pounds of phosphorus, almost 160 pounds of potassium, calcium, magnesium. I mean, does this look like there's a problem if you're switching from here to here and there's only maybe a 10% difference in the nutrient content from a 0 to 6 to 6 to 12? Is nutrient stratification a problem on that farm with just a 10% difference? Probably not. And then we start looking at nitrogen. How much nitrogen's here in the 6 to 12? 61 pounds. That's 130 pounds of nitrogen that we picked up in the top acre foot. That is a lot of money. Now you're talking about $90 an acre in savings on nitrogen that we didn't have to apply on this corn crop. Look at our percent MAC. We're still over 154%. We're still at 200 respirations. You know, there's a lot of information that you can pull off. And look, we're still looking at these ratios of calcium to magnesium, sodium and potassium. You know, these are things that we can still look at these ratios and see, are we going to have a problem? Now, if this sodium was a 40 and the potassium was 83, we're probably going to see very little potassium availability to that corn crop in that 6 to 12. If we're seeing closer to that, you know, that'd be a 2 to 1 at that point. Any other questions on the Haney? Man, y'all need some more coffee tonight. So this is probably the most controversial thing I've ever done on my farm. I just want to say publicly that if you ever call me out on social media and say what I'm doing is stupid and I prove you wrong, I'm going to call your name out publicly all around the country. You've been warned. This is the Haney test. This is the Mehlich 3. Haney test, Mehlich 3. And down here was the Haney test with my farm program. These are 5-acre blocks. We don't do anything like the university does in North Carolina. I don't believe in doing something 20 feet wide and 50 feet long and saying that that's valid. That's crap. I'm going to do it the entire length of the field, and we're going to do it in acres because that's what we farm. We don't farm feet, we farm acres. Early season beans. Which one of these would you rather have? Would you rather have this Haney bean or would you rather have this Mehlich bean? This is the Haney beans. This is the Mehlich beans. I think the video's next. All right, here we go, Willie. So this is Willie from Ward Laboratory. And Willie said that what I was doing was crazy, stupid, and wasting